I mean, who do they think I am? Fucking Beretta. I swear. Here I am, world-class operator, trying to operate, but I'm operationally compromised by this goddamn Beretta M9. The slide's gonna break, hit me in the face, break my shades, ruin my hair, ruin my tactical mojo. I need something more elite, that's suited to my elite operator ways. Pardon me, would you have a P226? But of course. Yes, the Sig Sauer P226 is the Wonder 9 of choice for discerning connoisseurs of tactical finery. With it comes an air of elitism that few production-grade handguns can match. You might even call it tactical gourmet. And while the P226 has come to exemplify good taste in combat handguns, its original recipe prioritizes substance over flavor. And that's what we're going to talk about today, here on Hipster Tactical. Alright folks, Sig P226, finally, and you've seen it, you know it, you probably love it, and it's high time I talk about it on the channel. And this one is a classic 1988 model with the original stamped slide, and these are currently being made today, but this is a classic one. It's just an icon. It is an archetype. It is something... If you're into guns, you know the P226. It's kind of a legend. As the corny intro kind of suggests, it has this air of elitism and superiority to it. I think there's this kind of soft consensus that in many ways it's better than its closest competitor, the Beretta 92. And we're going to get into that. But, you know, holding a P226, especially one of these old West German ones, it just feels quintessential. It like taps into some archetype we all kind of have of what it means to be tactical and what tactical should and does feel like. It feels functional yet refined. Everything fits together really, really well. It feels precise. It feels efficient. It feels very high quality. It's like it feels like an old German car. You know, before German cars were just ostentatious and overpriced and just about status, when they were functional machines built to drive well. That's kind of what this feels like. And then you shoot this thing, and it's just fine. So anticlimactic feels a little bit melodramatic, but still, there's some part of me that expected like some sort of religious experience the first time I shot a P226. Yeah, it's smooth. Yeah, it's accurate. Yeah, it's remarkably composed under recoil, but I don't know, there's just like no fire in my loins when I shoot it, you know? It's just a nice, well-made, very reliable, very accurate pistol. And surprise, surprise, that's exactly what Sig in Switzerland designed it to be back in the 70s. So, as I'm sure most of you know, this story begins with the Sig P210. The P210 is somewhat based on Charles Petter's M1935A pistol, which France used, and the Sig P210 was also known as the P49, and it was the gun that Switzerland issued to its army beginning in 1949. And the P210 was extremely accurate, extremely well made, and extremely expensive for a service pistol. And, you know, a lot of it was hand-fit, handmade. It was just one of the most precise handguns ever made. It's kind of on the level of like a custom 1911. Unfortunately, I can't afford one. They're like $3,000, but, you know, by the late 60s, early 70s, Switzerland couldn't really afford it either. It was just too expensive to issue to an army. So they began looking for something that could kind of balance, you know, quality and accuracy and refinement with something that was more affordable and just more approachable for an issue pistol. And of course, you know, being kind of late 60s, early 70s, they wanted to go into something that was double action, single action. The P210 was single action only. And what they came up with, obviously, became the Sig P220. And I tend to think people see the P220 as kind of a more plebeian, more utilitarian version of the P210. But based on what I can see, the P220 doesn't have hardly anything in common mechanically with the P210. It's a completely different gun that was kind of redesigned from the ground up. There were kind of 4 big innovations on the P220 that, you know, went on to define the rest of the Sig Sauer line, and in many ways, modern handguns in general. The first one of those is this stamped slide. So instead of a machine slide, Sig pioneered the use of a stamped slide that was, you know, required a lot less machining, and back then, kind of before CNC machining was a big thing, it was probably a lot cheaper to fold a piece of sheet metal into a slide and weld the end on. Not sure that's the case now, but then it probably was. Also, another big thing was this kind of squared off breech section. They kind of took a section of the barrel closer to the breech, squared it off so it locked into the ejection port, which precluded the need for the concentric lugs that you typically found on most tilting barreled guns up until this point. And, you know, especially with a gun like the Sig P210, which is extremely tightly fit, kind of hand-tuned, fitting those concentric lugs into their recesses on the slide, that was a lot of work. It was expensive. This kind of saved them from doing that. And interestingly, Sig Sauer didn't invent this concept. If you look back at patents, there's a patent in 1906 from an English engineer named John William Whiting, and he implemented something almost exactly like this on Webley's early semi-automatic pistols. TFBTV actually has a good video on the early Webley semi-autos. I forget the guy. It's not James and it's not Hop. It's one of the other guys. He talks about, you know, the Webley pistol using this design basically, and it becoming kind of the standard for modern pistols. So that's interesting. Also, the P210 went to this like closed slot cam path design that made the lockup really tight, really precise, and the P220 does not use that. Again, it's, from what I can tell, it has nothing in common with the P210. The Sig Sauer P226 designs use kind of an open slot design that's more similar to what you find on a Browning high power. So that's interesting. And also interesting, the CZ75 line basically, from what I can tell, has a lot more in common with the P210 than the P220 series of guns. The CZ75s use that kind of closed slot that the P210 used, and they also use the P210's inverted slide rails. Also, the P220 series of guns did use Charles Petter's bushingless muzzle design. From what I can tell, that was really the only innovation that carried through from the M1935A to the P210 to the P220. They always say that it's a Browning Petter style lockup, and like, from what I can tell, Petter's only contribution to, you know, what became the modern kind of pattern for semi-automatic pistols is this muzzle design. And basically that's where the aperture on the slide, where the barrel passes through, is kind of sloped on the top and the bottom slightly. So it still pinches the barrel, but it allows it to tilt, and you don't need a separate bushing, which has to be separately fit and separately accurized. So again, it makes the design more efficient as a whole. So as far as I can tell, the two guys whose names came up the most in terms of developing the P226 series of pistols were Edward Broadback, who I guess kind of ran Sig's in Switzerland's product development division back in the early 70s. He also designed the Sig 550 rifle, and another guy named Walter Ludwig. And Walter Ludwig actually went on to design the P88 series, and he also helped design the Walther P5. So Yes, he worked on a lot of kind of Germanic handguns back in the day. And there was another guy that came up in Wikipedia named Hans-Peter Sig. I guess it wasn't like Sig, his last name was actually Sig, but it had 2 G's instead of 1. I get the sense that most of the intellectual heavy lifting for the design of the P226 series of SIGs was done in Switzerland, in Neuhausen. And though, clearly this decocker that we all know and love on SIGs, that is kind of a hand-me-down from the Sauer 38H pistol, so clearly Sauer played some role in the design of the gun from the get-go, and as we know, the Sig Sauer pistols were produced by Sauer in Germany to get around Switzerland's strict import laws, or export laws. So in 1975, the era of the Sig P210's glorious hand-fit accuracy comes to an end, and the Swiss Army adopts the P220 as the P75. From what I understand, it was well received, it was well liked, and it was well respected. It's worth noting that the P220 originally was designed in 9mm, but in the United States, we kind of know the P220 as a 45. And basically, they just designed another version of it for the American market. 9mm P220s were very rarely imported into the United States, and that's why we just associate the P220 with a 45 caliber gun in the United States. So, fast forward to kind of the end of the 70s, early 80s, the United States military starts looking for a new service pistol to replace the 1911. As of 1976, Beretta has a good double stack service pistol with the 92. And, Sig Sauer has the P220, full-size, modern, double-action service pistol, but it's a single stack. So I don't think it's too hard to do the math on this. They basically took a, double stack Browning high power-esque magazine, crammed it into the P220, and that gave them their double stack 9mm combat pistol that's, basically a double stack version of the P220, and they called that the P226. So the initial phases of the US military pistol trials, I think, kind of started with the Air Force, and they were kind of the first ones to start looking for a new pistol. They looked at the Beretta, and it did well in those tests, and then the Army kind of officially took over the testing procedures, and there were a couple different rounds of testing, which became known as the XM9 trials. There was a round in 1981, a round in 1984, and as we all know, those trials are just kind of steeped in myth, legend, and controversy, and hearsay. There's a lot of unknowns. I wasn't there. I don't know how they were tested, and was there bias? Was there favoritism? Who knows? But I think definitively we can say that really the two best pistols of those trials were the P226 and the Beretta 92. They were the only ones really that were worthy of the contract. I looked at the 1986 GAO report. I'm not even sure what GAO stands for, but it's kind of a government report of what happened in the 1984 trials. And if you look at some of the numbers on those, both the 92 and the P226 were just light years ahead of their competitors in terms of reliability. If you look at mean rounds between stoppages, the next closest competitor below those two was the Smith & Wesson 459, and it was 400 and some mean rounds between stoppages. And then you go up to the Beretta 92, and it was 1,700 mean rounds between stoppages. I mean, just night and day. But then you look at the P226, and it had 2,800 mean rounds between stoppages. It was 1,000 rounds more than the Beretta. So right there, it's just wow, and why didn't the military adopt the P226 over the Beretta 92? Well, looking at some of the other tests, the Beretta actually did better in the mud tests than the P226, especially the dry mud tests. It did quite a bit better. And the 92 had a bit higher service life, I guess, in terms, it was 7,000 or something like this. It was 5,000. Don't quote me. Looking at those, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it did a little bit better on the service life than the P226. So at the end of the day, they both more than met the requirements. You can argue which one should have been the pistol. According to the lore we're all familiar with, the Beretta gave the government kind of a lower cost per unit in terms of the pistol, but also the maintenance and the parts, and they were going to set up a factory in the United States. So the kind of narrative is that, you know, the military, you know, went with this because it was cheaper, not because it was better. I love both these guns. I think they're both excellent. I think they're both worthy of the contract. I think the military made a good choice with Beretta 92 becoming the M9. But when, you know, that decision was made, the Navy SEALs started testing the M9, and they didn't like it. They had some broken slides, as I kind of, you know, poked fun at in the intro, and some sides broke, hit some guys in the face, knocked some teeth out. Actually did injure some guys. That actually happened from what I understand, but I've also read that, you know, they were using like plus P plus ammo, and they're shooting like thousands of rounds through it, and like, yeah, the gun broke. Big surprise. Anyway, the U.S. Navy SEALs refused to adopt the Beretta, and in 1989, they insisted on the P226 as their pick, and that became the MK25. As we got into like kind of the late 80s and 90s, especially the 90s, reports started coming in from Army use, especially like in Iraq. People were complaining about the Beretta 92 in terms of its reliability, and, you know, like, this gun sucks, and it would jam in the sand, yada, yada, yada. And really, in the early 90s, the Beretta's reputation suffered, whereas, you know, the P226, those who knew that the Special Forces favored the SIG. And so the SIG kind of elevated into this elite status, where the Beretta 92 was seen as like the mistake, and the government cheaped out on something that, you know, wasn't as good. But you have to keep in mind, if you have hundreds of thousands of these guns that are just beat to shit and not maintained and nobody knows how to shoot them, people are going to say they suck. You know, if you have elite operators using these, kind of using the guns to their full potential, yeah, they're going to like them. So when I was getting into guns in, you know, kind of the mid-2000s, I wanted SIGs. And Glocks were super hyped during the 90s, and, you know, I thought they were kind of neat. They were just different than what I'd grown up seeing as far as guns. They were just kind of minimalistic and European and sophisticated. But, you know, once I discovered SIGs, it kind of had that same vibe, but they just seemed a little more sexy. And, you know, they're what the FBI carried. They were like the classy agency guns. They were German. They were a little more expensive. They were a little less known than some of the other brands. And I just thought they were so cool. And Jack Bauer carried that two-tone P229 and 24, which occasionally became a two-tone P228, continuity errors, but like that was just kind of the pinnacle of Sig Sauer's monopoly on like tactical shit in the early 2000s. So SIGs are what I was really into. They're kind of my first love with guns. But before we start to slather that tactical Grey Poupon everywhere, let's remember that the original SIG P226 design was designed to be simple, affordable, and functional. And, you know, if there's one word I would use to describe the feel of Sig Sauer P226 pistols in general, it's functional. But functional doesn't mean bad. In the case of Sig Sauer pistols, functional can mean precise. Functional means solid. Functional feels just satisfying in this kind of stoic, machinish, no BS kind of way. And when I get this 1988 P226 in my hands, just oozing with old school German quality, all like the good, positive attributes of functional really come to life in a way I just love. And that translates into how the P226 shoots, and really most SIG P226 pistols, and that's what we're gonna get into now.
These things, they push off the glasses, and it's like
So when you grab this thing, this kind of broad, curvaceous grip just seamlessly melds with your palm. It feels really comfortable, really neutral, and you've got this big kind of massive monolithic slide that sits high above your hand, and it has this certain sense of like mechanical majesty to it. And you know, when you put your fingertip against that trigger, bring it up to this wall, and the wall is very precise and just tidy feeling, you just feel like you're a part of a machine, and a machine that's designed to do tactical shit with tactical efficiency in a tactical way. Like I said, there's nothing that's gonna like change your life about the way a SIG shoots generally, but it's still satisfying in like its own SIG-ish way. The single action trigger brake on a SIG, especially this P226, it's so precise. It's almost like, it almost feels brittle, like you're breaking glass. It's a little bit lighter and more precise feeling than what you find on a Beretta 92. And then, you know, the reset, it kind of pushes your finger right back to the brake, and it's just enough of a click to kind of say, shoot me again. And you do, even though it's nothing, you know, nothing life-changing. And some guns just have this very intuitive sense of the way they shoot, and you don't quite get that with a SIG, but it's still very satisfying and very enjoyable to shoot. And the recoil on a SIG, it just almost seems to disappear, you know, especially on this P226. And you know, a lot of people complain about the bore axis on SIGs. They've got high bore axes. They definitely do. One thing I think the bore axis critics tend to miss is that while the muzzle does rise more when you have a higher bore axis, that actually means less recoil energy gets imparted into your hand. So I find that guns with a higher bore axis and, you know, more muzzle rise actually feel softer when you're shooting than guns where, you know, the recoil or the bore axis is lower and the recoil impulse is kind of going straight back into the bones of your hand. And while there is a slight cost of, you know, time between shots before your sights recover and fall back on target, it's minimal. And as you can see from the shooting footage, I'm having no trouble double tapping this gun. It shoots fast. It was easy to shoot fast. It was pleasant to shoot fast. And so when you're shooting this thing, you know the recoil's there. You know the muzzle's rising, but it's very transparent. It's just kind of seamless. And in a way, it's almost weightless. Like you're hardly even aware of the recoil impulse. And that's where I tend to think the Sig Sauer series of pistols gives you a little less feel in terms of the recoil impulse, a little less context, a little less feedback than some other designs. Where, you know, if you've watched my other videos, you know I love the Beretta 92, you know, I love how it shoots. The recoil impulse on a Beretta 92 seems to just kind of flow, and it feels kind of buoyant, and you just get a sense of what the gun's doing and ultimately what your shot's doing when you shoot a Beretta 92. It just gives you more context, it gives you more feedback, whereas a SIG, not so much. It can feel a little clinical. It's still accurate, it's still smooth, it still has a really nice recoil impulse, but you just don't quite get the feel you do in some other guns. And even, I recently reviewed my Ruger P89, even like the kind of floaty kerchunk you get with a P89, I feel gives you a little bit more context, a little more feedback than you get with a SIG. And again, that's not to say SIGs aren't accurate and SIGs aren't shoot really well. I actually shot I did some of the best shooting I've done in recent memory with this P226 in the past month or two. As a point of comparison, I would say my Walther P88 Compact feels the most similar to a SIG in terms of just the character of it, of how it shoots. It has that kind of efficient, functional feel to it like a SIG does, but in some ways the P88 feels even more clinical than I think a SIG does. And while I think the accuracy potential is slightly higher on the P88 platform, it's probably the most similar to the SIGs. So another thing about the Sig P226 and kind of the Sig Sauer platform in general is I have small hands, and the Beretta 92 just fits my hands better. It really does. The trigger reach is a lot shorter on, well, not a lot shorter, but it's shorter enough that it makes a big difference for me in terms of how I interface with the gun. The back strap is just a little straighter on the 92. It allows me to just get my hand up into the gun more on the Beretta than I do on the Sig. And it just feels like when I'm gripping a Sig, it feels like I'm more on top of the grip than, whereas with a Beretta, it feels like I'm getting into the gun more, and I just feel more in tune with it. I feel closer to it. I just feel like I have better control. Now, I will say that I got, these are the original OG grips, which I love and they look super cool, but I got some G10 grips for this. Hogue has a new kind of sub-brand of grips called the Contour Classic grips, and they're a little different from their normal G10 grips which have just kind of flat, straight sides. The Contour Classic have, as you might expect, just more of a curve on the sides of the grip, and it really feels good. And you know, obviously you get the very aggressive, grippy texture of G10. That's kind of what we all like with G10. But the curvature that you get on, it's almost like a palm swell that you get on the Contour Classic. I find that the curve on the side of the Contour Classic grips just gives me more kind of meat to push against, more to index against, and it really locks the gun in my hand. And when I was shooting this gun on my final range trip for this review with those grips, man, I couldn't miss. I mean, you know, you get that really good Sig Sauer trigger, especially on the P226, and it was great. I mean, shots were going through the same hole. Even if the recoil impulse and just the overall feel isn't quite as communicative as what you get on some other guns like a Beretta 92, it didn't matter. I mean, this gun shot so freaking well. And not surprisingly, I had no reliability issues with this gun. I put around 500 rounds through it, no problems. It ran like a watch, a Swiss watch, which it is kind of Swiss, so that makes sense. But, you know, given the performance in the XM9 trials, these guns are reliable. They run, and no one is surprised about that. So, kind of moving into a conclusion here, does the P226 live up to its reputation for tactical gourmet? Yes and no. You know, it has a simple, effective recipe, to kind of continue with the food metaphor, that just continues to work very well even after 40 years, and it probably always will work well. Are there more engaging guns to shoot? Yes. Are there guns that have a slightly better feel? Yes. There are probably guns that are more accurate too. But if you want a Wonder 9 that's just plain fucking good, if you want a Wonder 9 that makes no excuses, takes no shit, and just wins gunfights, if you want a Wonder 9 that feels like quality and shoots blow your mind groups with calm, collected efficiency, you want a Sig P226. And trust me, you want a Sig P226, especially one of these old school West German ones. So that's what we've got today on the P226. Thank you so much for watching. This is Hipster Tactical, and I am Matt.